All right, pop quiz. I want you to take a look at these two stencils and tell me what's different about them. Obviously, the designs are a little bit different, but they're the same size. They're made out of the same material, so why is one of them a whopping 41 times more expensive? I'll tell you why. This one you can buy at the craft store for about $7, and this one you can make at home for a mere 17 cents. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can create and cut your own stencils from home, whether you're looking for a simple single layered stencil or something more elaborate like a layered stencil set. I'm going to show you how you can get exactly the design you want at the price you deserve, and I promise it's a lot easier than you might think. Let's get to it. All right, before we dive into making our stencils, let's just talk very briefly about what you'll actually need to start making your own stencils at home. For starters, you will need a cutting machine. Today, I'm going to be using the Cricut Joy Extra. Now, of course, a cutting machine is not cheap. So if you don't already own a cutting machine, this is a significant added cost up front, but I'm willing to bet a lot of you already own one. Now, when it comes to selecting a cutting machine, I can only speak to the Cricut machines because that's what I use, but you can use any currently sold and marketed Cricut machine to create stencils. Now, due to the size that we typically want to make our stencils, especially for card making, I would recommend working on something that is the size of the Cricut Joy Extra or larger. You can create stencils using the smaller Cricut Joy. They're just going to be smaller, of course. So if you want a larger footprint to create those 6x6 stencils or larger, I would recommend looking at the Cricut Joy Extra or any of the larger machines. Now, assuming you have your cutting machine, the next thing that you're going to need, of course, is the material to actually create your stencils with. And for that, I would suggest using a relatively thick Mylar material. What I'm using here is a 7mm blank stencil sheet. I just grabbed this off of Amazon. I will leave that linked down below. I wouldn't recommend going any thicker than 7mm. I have experimented with using 10mm sheets, which do work, but they can be pretty rough on your Cricut blade because it requires a lot of passes to actually cut through a material that thick. I wouldn't recommend going any heavier than 7mm. You can go lighter if you'd like. They sell 5mm, 4mm, 6mm Mylar. You can pick the thinness that works best for you. Just know that the thicker it is, the more durable and longer it might last, but the thinner it is, the easier it's going to be to cut. And you don't even have to use Mylar. This is just what I like to use because it is a semi-transparent material, so you can actually see through your stencil, which, as I'm sure all of you know, can be very helpful and important when you're crafting. It's also a very smooth, washable surface, so it's very easy to rinse your stencils off and reuse them over time. But if you wanted to, for instance, if you're creating a stencil that you're only going to use one time and you want to make this even cheaper, you could of course make stencils using cardstock or construction paper. Just know that those aren't going to be able to be necessarily reusable and rinsable and cleanable, and they're not going to last as long because they're just not as sturdy. Now, this particular pack of Mylar sheets comes in 12 by 12 sheets, so that's 12 inches by 12 inches. And if you're familiar with the card making world, a lot of our stencils typically come in 6x6 squares. So essentially, if you cut very carefully for each sheet of Mylar you're getting in here, you're getting 4 different 6x6 stencils per sheet, and there's 10 pieces in here. So that comes out to 40 stencils if you cut very carefully. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and pull out one of these sheets, and then I'm just going to carefully cut it down, and we're going to jump into creating our very first 6x6 stencil. When it comes to actually designing the stencils, you have a couple of options. So if you are an illustrator or designer, of course you can jump into something like Adobe Illustrator, create your own designs, upload them to Cricut Design Space, and cut them out. Obviously, that gives you unlimited options and possibilities. But if that's not you, which is totally fair, you can also use the thousands of images that Cricut already has available to you in Cricut Design Space to use those images and turn them into stencils. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do right now. So let's grab our computer and open up Cricut Design Space. So here we are in Cricut Design Space. We have a brand new, fresh, empty file here. And what I'm going to start off by doing is going over here to Shapes on the left-hand side. I'm going to grab the square and just stretch this out to create a 6x6 square. And what I'm doing is just creating the silhouette of our stencil. So you can see up here right now we have 6x6 inches. Perfect. I'm going to zoom out just a tiny bit here. And then I'm going to change the color by going up here to this little square and changing it just to a light gray to kind of look more like our Mylar stencil. You don't have to do this necessarily, just trying to make things easy for you. So you can imagine now here in Design Space, this is our blank 6x6 stencil. Now to actually design something into that stencil, let's go over here on the left-hand side to Images. And when it comes to picking out images for your stencil, you're going to start to learn what works well and what doesn't for stenciling. For instance, you don't necessarily want an image that's going to have a lot of closed loops. For instance, if I wanted to create a stencil using this wake up and do your best image here, I could cut this out using my stencil, but imagine in these cut lines, for instance, for this O, I'm going to cut out this outer ring, and then I'm going to cut out this middle ring, and what I'm going to end up in the stencil is just one big hole, right? So you're going to want to kind of look out for those kinds of things. And also when it comes to creating your stencils using a Cricut, I would suggest it's better to look for less intricate, less complicated cuts. You want things that are going to be pretty clean and open and not have a lot of jagged edges, because at the end of the day, you are cutting out a pretty thick layer of plastic using a blade, so you can only get so intricate. For instance, the stencils that you buy at the store are typically created using a laser printer, so they're actually cutting out their intricate designs using a laser, which you can get a lot more intricate and well-defined than you can with a blade. So just keep in mind that is one of the trade-offs here when you're creating your stencils at home. You're not necessarily going to be able to make ones that are as intricate as the ones that you can buy at the store. But that being said, a lot of the stencils you're buying at the store aren't intricate, and you can make them yourselves. So let's go ahead and look for a design that we might want to do. For instance, let's do zebra print. I don't have a zebra print stencil. Okay, and look, this is actually super easy because a lot of these are already square images to begin with, so that's perfect. Let's just go ahead and grab this first one here. And then what I want to do is just size it down so that it fits within our stenciled square here and leaves kind of a border around the edge, because you, of course, want it to be all one piece. And if you can't center it, you don't have a great eye for it, what you can do is just select both layers, which you can do by clicking out here and dragging. You can see that selects both layers. They're both highlighted over here. Go up to Align, click Center horizontally, and then Center vertically. And now you can know those are lined up just perfectly. Now from here, it couldn't be simpler. Let's go ahead and select those again. You can see they're both highlighted. And then down here at the bottom, click on Combine. You're going to get a little drop-down arrow here. And what we're going to click on here is Subtract. And ta-da, you basically have your stencil. So what that did is it took the zebra pattern that was on top of your blank stencil and it basically removed everything that was under that zebra pattern, if that makes sense, leaving you with the cutout of your zebra print stencil. Now, one thing you might want to be wary about if you are looking at your stencil at this point in time, like one thing that's calling out to me right here is you see how thin this little connected part is right here. I know as an avid stencil user that that might be troublesome, and there's actually little tricks you can use to help you with that as well. So let's go back over here to Shapes, and then I am going to click the square. What I'm going to do is just make a tiny little rectangle box. Let me zoom in here. Okay, so something like this, and then just line it up just perfectly, make it a little thicker. Okay, so you can see how this part that meets the edge of the stencil is a little bit thicker. Let me go ahead and recolor this to gray. And then again, I can select the stencil and that part by clicking and dragging both. You can see they're both highlighted here. And then let's go back to Combine, and this time I'm going to click Unite. And ta-da! Now that edge is magically thicker. So that's just an example of one of the small little fine-tuning steps you might want to make. But aside from that, this stencil is ready to go. So let's go ahead and go up here and click Make. I don't need to save the project. We're going to be cutting on the mat. And then you can see here we have the stencil on the mat as usual. Let's go ahead and click Continue. Now this is where things can get a little tricky, because when you go to select your material, you're going to have to actually create a custom material. Now fortunately for you, I've already taken out a lot of the guesswork and have found custom material settings that work for this 7mm Mylar. But if you are using a different machine or maybe a different thickness of Mylar, you're going to want to test these settings on your own. So if you didn't know, when you go to select your materials in Cricut and click Browse All Materials, this is going to show you all of the most used and typical materials that you would cut with your Cricut that the Cricut is already programmed to handle. Unfortunately, the Cricut is not already programmed to handle 7mm Mylar, so we're going to have to create a custom material. What you can do by scrolling all the way down here, actually you don't need to scroll, you just need to go down here and click Material Settings. And then this is, again, going to show you all of the materials, but it's also showing you the individual settings for each material, and you have two settings here. You have cut pressure and multi-cut. So this is telling you how much pressure the machine is actually putting on that blade when it's going to cut the material. And then multi-cut is how many passes are we running over the material. For instance, if you're cutting a circle, are you cutting that circle 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, etc.? You can see here I've actually already added 7mm Mylar. This is a custom material I added. And I found that the best settings are a cut pressure of 350, and we're going to cut each line 5 times, which I know sounds like a lot, and that's because it is. Which brings up another point that I like to make when it comes to creating your own stencils at home. It is going to put a bit of wear on your Cricut blade. I would actually suggest having a separate blade that perhaps you only use for making stencils, because otherwise it can start to wear down your blades rather quickly, and you don't want to be using a dull blade for your other more intricate, fine-tuned projects. So just keep that in mind. But again, I already have this material created, but if you didn't, you could scroll down all the way to the bottom and click Add New Material. You can add your material name. For instance, if you have 5mm Mylar, maybe you create a new material for that. And then you can select your own cut settings. Now, this is something that when you're first getting started, you're probably going to need to experiment with a bit. If you've never used that material and you're not getting your settings from elsewhere, I would suggest just cutting very basic shapes. For instance, create a square or a circle. Don't go out and create a full stencil, because chances are when you're testing these settings for the first time, you're probably not going to get it right on the first pass. But for instance, for 5mm Mylar, maybe it needs to be the same cut pressure, but instead of cutting it 5 times, maybe you only have to cut it 3 times. I don't know. Again, I don't use 5mm Mylar, but I'm just giving you an example of how you might go about testing these settings for the material that you choose to use. All right, but all that being said, let's go ahead and select the 7mm Mylar that I'm using, and then we're ready to cut our stencil. So remember, I've already cut down my blank stencil sheet here. This is actually a little bit larger than 6 by 6 inches. I prefer to make my blank stencils a little bit larger than 6 by 6 inches and then just cut the full 6 by 6 inch stencil out of that blank. You don't have to do it that way. I just find that to be the easiest for me mentally than trying to do the math to fit 4 stencils into the 12 by 12 full sheet, if you feel me. But again, if you want to be conservative and do it differently, more power to you. So let's go ahead and add this to our mat here by lining it up in the corner. And then since we are using a lot of pressure and cutting over the same area several times, I like to use a brayer and just make sure that that Mylar is stuck on there as best as it can be. And then at that point, let's go ahead and bring our Cricut back into frame and load her up. And there you have it. After just a few minutes of cutting, we have our beautiful zebra print stencil. Now let's go ahead and test it out, shall we? And to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and bring in my grip mat here to help hold my cardstock in place for my stenciling. And then I have just a random piece of cardstock scrap that I had laying around. Now let's just go ahead and put our stencil right on top. It's not really centered, but that's okay. And then using some purple ink, let's go ahead and test it out. I don't know why I'm using purple. I would use black, but for some reason, I don't know, purple's calling to me. And there you go. It's working just as any normal stencil would. I'm not going to be too crazy about the application here because we're just testing it out, but I just wanted to, you know, show it in action a little bit. Now this is a rather delicate stencil because we have a lot of loose ends due to the nature of the zebra stripes, which is fine. You just, you know, want to be kind of careful as you're applying the ink. Ta-da! Look at that. we have a beautiful zebra printed piece of cardstock. Now remember, since we used Mylar, all you have to do to clean this is just give it a quick little rinse under the sink and it'll clean right up. You could also just use a wet rag and wipe it down, but because we are using that 7mm Mylar, you can clean it off, store it away, and use it again later. Now, this was a great example of a single layered stencil, but let's go ahead and take a look at how we might make a multi-layered stencil. Now, back over Design Space, you'll see again that we're starting with just a blank file here, and we're gonna go ahead and pick out an image or a pattern that we might wanna use for a layered stencil set. So go ahead over here to the left-hand side and click Images again. I'm gonna go ahead and click Advanced Search just so that we can see more options here. And then you can go ahead and search for a pattern or image that you're interested in. For instance, you could search something like abstract elements. And then typically what I would do is I would go over here on the left-hand side and filter my search to cut files only, and also go ahead and click multiple image layers. Now you're just going to look through here and see if you can find something that fits your fancy. For instance, something like this would work really well because you can see that you have multiple objects using the same color here. So you can imagine you could create a stencil layer for just the green, a stencil layer for just this orangish yellow, same for the blue, and same for the orange. So you would end up with a 4-layered stencil set in this case. Now, I don't know if that's exactly the pattern I want to use, so let me keep searching. You could also do a stencil that has overlapping images, for instance, something like this. You can imagine here you would have 3 different layers of stencils. You would have a layer for this little circle back here, and then this blob, and then the rainbow, and you would just layer those on top of each other and ink them up. But I'm finding myself really drawn to this blobs image from Jordan Allison Designs. I feel like it looks like it's meant to be on a card already, and I don't know, I'm just drawn to the colors. So let's go ahead and play with that one. So I added it to my canvas. Let's go ahead and look over at my canvas. And then for this, what we're going to want to do is create another stencil. I'm going to go ahead and change this to gray like we did earlier. And since this is not a square pattern, I'm going to go ahead and make kind of a rectangle stencil. So doing a little bit of guesstimating here, but let's imagine it being, let's say, 5 inches wide and 6 inches tall. Sure. And then you can see right now our pattern is behind the stencil. You can change that in 2 ways by either right-clicking on your pattern and then click Bring to Front. Now, I'm actually realizing I may have gotten ahead of myself and created the stencil blank first, but since this is going to be a card front, how I'm imagining it, I kind of want it to be proportionate to a card front. So let's go ahead and bring this out until we have that kind of 4¼ by 5½ inch. Okay, wow, it looks almost exactly like we want it to, really. So let's get this to 5½ inches, and it's 4½ inches, that's okay. I'll actually, you know what, let's just bring it in a little, that's not gonna hurt anything. Okay, so now we know that that is proportionate to a card front, but it's a little big because I don't want the design to go all the way to the edge of my card front, so let's shrink it a tiny bit. And the way you want to shrink this is hold down the Shift button on your laptop and then grab one of the corners here, and you can move it in and out. As long as you're holding that Shift button down, you're going to keep your proportions the same as whatever it was when you started holding the Shift. So if I'm going smaller, it's still keeping proportionate to that card front size. Does that make sense? Make sure you're holding down that Shift button. So we're going from 4¼ to 5½, and then I'm just going to move it down a little bit so that maybe there's just a little bit of a margin on all of the edges. And then let's go back over to our stencil here and size that appropriately. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. So what we've done so far is we've figured out our sizing, right? So we have our pattern here sized to a card front, which is what we want, but this is all still one package, right? So here's what we're gonna do next. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see we have our blobs layer. If you expand this, the way this was designed is it's actually made up of a bunch of little layers here. For instance, you have these 2 little orange guys right here, which you can turn off and on by clicking this eye icon. But what I want to do is I actually want to group all of the like colors together. So all of the oranges together, all of the coral together, and all of the pink together. So the way I'm going to do that first is I'm going to click this group, and I'm actually going to ungroup all of these layers and bits. And then what I'm going to do is find all of the similar colors. So for instance, this first one looks like, if you're having trouble finding exactly what it is, you can just turn this layer on and off and you can see them, appear and reappear. So that's an orange. So I'm going to keep that on. This is also an orange. I'm going to keep that on. This is not an orange. Let's turn that off for now. That's orange. We're going to keep it. Not an orange. Turn it off. Not an orange. Turn it off. Not an orange. Turn it off. Orange. We'll keep it. What was that? Was that? Nope. Not an orange. Okay. And not an orange. All right, so we have all of our orange pieces, and what I'm doing is I'm just clicking and dragging to bring them all together. This is purely for organizational purposes. You don't necessarily have to do every step I'm doing. I'm just trying to make it very clear kind of what we're doing here. So I'm gonna click Shift and click all 4 of these, all of the orange ones. And then once I've done that, I'm gonna go down here and click Attach. So now all of these 4 layers of orange are all one piece together. And then I'm just going to rename that to orange, just so we don't get confused. Now, let's do the same thing for the other 2 colors. So let's go ahead and start turning these back on, and I'll collect all of the coral this time. Okay, so we have 3 layers of coral. Again, I'm going to group them together, click, press Shift, hold Shift, and go ahead and click the other 3 layers and attach. And so now this is the coral group. And then last but not least, we have our 3 pink layers, which is now the pink group. Now what I'm going to do, and I'm hoping this doesn't seem excessive yet, I'm going to go ahead and select all 3 of these again. So hold down Shift, click all 3, right click, and now I'm going to group them. So they're in their 3 different layers, but they're all grouped together for organizational purposes, and so I can click and drag them around all together. But as you might be asking yourself now, okay, Ralph, but we only have 1 stencil blank over here. And that's right, so we want 2 more of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy, or you can Command-C, Control-C, and then I'm going to paste. And then I'm going to paste again, or you can Command-V. So now we have 3, because we have 3 colors in our design. Now what I want to do is stack all of these on top of each other. So we have our 3 stencils here. Let me go ahead and select all 3 of them, and then using the Align tool, again, let's align center, align vertically. So all 3 of our layers are now perfectly on top of each other, and then let's click and drag our design up to the top layer again. And then let's also click all of these one more time, center horizontally, center vertically. All right, so what we have now is we have our 3-layer design on top of our 3 stencil layers. So what I'm going to do now is ungroup, and remember, you don't really have to group these together. I'm just trying to make things as foolproof as possible, so if that helps, do it. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. And what I want to do is one at a time select each layer. So let's leave the pink layer open, right? But let's turn off coral and orange. And then let's leave the first layer of the stencil blank, and then let's turn off the other 2. Does that make sense? So we only have the 1 pink layer and the 1 stencil blank layer selected. And then what we're going to do is click one, hold down Command, and click the other. So now we have both selected. And then go down to Combine and Subtract. So we're going to end up with a similar look as we did earlier when we did our zebra layer. So we have layer number 1. Go ahead and turn that off, and then turn on coral and turn on the second layer. Then same thing, click coral, hold down Command, click your second stencil blank, combine, subtract. Now we have layer number 2. Turn that off for now. Again, we'll turn orange on and do the same thing for the last time. Select both, combine, subtract. Now let's go ahead and turn the other 2 back on. At this point, we have 3 distinct stencil layers now. And because we lined them all up perfectly on top of each other, they're all going to layer beautifully exactly as they looked on the pattern. Now, in this case, I'm not too worried about layering them on top of each other because this is a fairly simple stencil. If you had multiple layers of a stencil and you needed to be very precise about placing them on top of each other when you're actually going to stencil, What you could do is add little registration marks in all 4 corners. So what that means is you could take a square, make it, super duper tiny. I'll zoom in here. And just add that to all 4 corners of your stencil, and then select your stencil and the square, subtract again. And then that's just gonna make a tiny little square hole in all 4 corners. And you can use that when you're actually going to stencil with your ink to help you line up all of your stencils. Now again, I'm not gonna worry about that with this set because it's a fairly simple design. So at this point, all I'm gonna do is go ahead and click Make. And at this point, you should already have your Mylar material set up. Now, if you didn't notice, I actually changed the Mylar settings to 4 times cut instead of 5. I did a little more testing around off camera. I think that 5 is a little extreme. So you should be able to get away with 350 cut pressure, 4 times multi-cut. But again, depending on your machine and what material you're using, you might need to do a little testing around yourself. So I'm gonna go ahead and click 7mm Mylar and cut these 3 layers out, and then I will meet you on the other side. All right, and there you have it. We have a beautiful, simple 3-layered stencil that is aligned just perfectly to give us a beautiful card front. And this time I'm going to use a full-size card front. So we have 4¼ inches across, 5½ inches up and down. And let's go ahead and start out with our first layer here. That looks pretty good to me. And I'm just gonna do a very similar color palette as what we saw in Cricut Design Space. So I'm gonna start out with some orange. This is Carved Pumpkin from the Distress line. And again, I'm gonna do this kind of quick and dirty. This isn't gonna be the most beautiful stenciling job in the world because I'm just trying to, it's a proof of concept, showing you that this works. All right, there we have layer number 1. Let's go ahead and see the reveal. Ta-da! Now let's bring in layer number 2. And I believe in the Design Space design, this was a coral color, this layer, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab Abandoned Coral. And for the pink layer, I'm gonna use the classic Kitsch Flamingo. My Kitsch Flamingo is quite honestly beginning to run out of ink, I think, so it might look a little more like spun sugar than Kitsch Flamingo, but that's okay. It's still pink, right? All right, and here we go. It's time for the final reveal. Wow, okay. Honestly, this is the first time I've used this stencil. Honestly, I guess I'm in love with this color palette. I had no idea. But look at how beautiful and perfect that looks. Now, keep in mind, a 3-layered layer stencil like this could cost upwards of $15 to $20, depending on where you buy it from. And we just made this out of a single sheet of our Mylar, which a pack of 10 is $7.99. So do the math yourself. This is an incredible savings. And honestly, it looks like you bought it from one of the name brand stores. Now, keep in mind, there are some limitations when it comes to creating your own stencils at home. For instance, there is the labor involved of actually designing, and even if you're not designing the stencil, you have to find an image and then sometimes tweak it or make the layers just right. There's a little bit of labor involved there, but if you're someone who enjoys that process, or if you're someone who wants a very specific design or stencil and you don't want to settle for something that's already out there, this is the perfect solution for you, and you're gonna save some money along the way. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll probably always continue to still buy stencils from some of my favorite brands, especially those that correspond with dies and stamps and things that I really enjoy. But if I'm looking for something unique or one of a kind, or if it's something simple that I know I can throw together myself, I'm pretty much always gonna make it myself now. What about you? Have you been inspired? And if you did enjoy this video and you're interested in learning more about the Cricut for card making, I think you'll enjoy this video over here where I talk about how you can actually create custom sentiments for your cards using your Cricut, almost like an infinite number of sentiment stamps. And if you did find this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up, maybe subscribe to the channel and join our little community over here. But most importantly, I appreciate you for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye, y'all.